Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche organization with your daily video update for August 12th, 2025. Today I'm going to talk about who's out to sabotage the Trump-Putin summit meeting coming up this Friday. The last in-person meeting between the two presidents was in June 2019 on the sidelines of the G20 summit in Japan. Why does the idea of a meeting between Trump and Putin cause so much panic among Western leaders? Why does a simple idea expressed by Donald Trump in his 2016 campaign, that he wants the US and Russia to be friends, why does that set in motion a campaign of lies and slander and provocations that ultimately are responsible for the war in Ukraine? Now, we started from the beginning of Russiagate to expose the truth that this was a phony story. I and some of my colleagues, including Helga Zepp-LaRouche and Diane Sayre, were put on a Ukrainian NATO hit list for telling the truth about Russiagate, that it was a fraud concocted from the beginning. And more importantly, it was not just Obama and his team of Brennan, Clapper, and others, but the story originated with British intelligence in the GCHQ and MI6, and it was brought to the United States, including the Steele dossier and so on. And this is now coming out in a new set of declassified documents released by Tulsi Gabbard, the Director of National Intelligence. And this is a story which is crucially important. That's why we wrote a white paper to go to the heart of it. Who's responsible and why? Why is it that the City of London and its allies in Wall Street and the United States were so committed to a confrontation between Russia and the United States? Now, the reality is that there's a common tradition between the United States and Russia, an alliance that goes back to the American Revolution, the Civil War, the two world wars of the 20th century. And during that period of time, we had a common enemy, the British Empire, not the people of the United Kingdom or Britain, but the oligarchs and the corporate cartels, and especially the financial interests based in the City of London. It was after the John F. Kennedy assassination that the US was brought into a full alliance with the British Empire, in which the United States eventually became the leading power because of the economic and military force that the United States represented. But the policy was coming from the British think tanks, in particular Chatham House and its US affiliate, the Council on Foreign Relations, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, which is the oldest military defense think tank in Britain, and the Atlantic Council, which is sort of a US-British operation, but is using, has used its pulpit to promote the continuation of the war in Ukraine as a war to weaken Russia. The Ukraine proxy war from the beginning was designed, as U.S. Defense Secretary from Raytheon, Lloyd Austin, said, was designed to weaken Russia. Now, this goes back to the post-Cold War policy of the United States. The idea that a Russian Eurasian perspective cannot be allowed to determine economic policy worldwide. And where did that come from? Initially from the British, from Halford Mackinder in British Geopolitics, but restated again in 1997 by Brzezinski, who essentially said that there cannot be any country allowed to take precedence in Eurasia, that must be a zone of influence of the United States. And that's why we've had permanent wars since that time. Now, the Maidan coup was an example of this, as Brzezinski singled out Ukraine as a pivot point for the US-Russian relations. So what does this mean? Well, Zelensky has been activated on high gear. He's on the phones, he's traveling everywhere. There have been meetings in London and Paris, Brussels, trying to figure out how to disrupt the Trump-Putin summit. Zelensky is nothing but a tool. but so are people like Starmer and Macron and Merz. They're puppets acting for the City of London oligarchs. Now, in contrast, Helga Zepp-LaRouche of the Schiller Institute has issued an open letter to Trump and Putin to discuss what would serve the interests of not only the people of Russia and the United States, but of the world. And she wrote the following: "When you are meeting in Alaska, the fate of humanity lies in your hands." And she proposed as a concrete affirmation of peaceful cooperation, a joint venture to build a link between the US and Russia across the Bering Strait. Not only between the US and Russia, but one which through a global network of rail lines could connect Eurasia and the Americas. Now, this is why the war hawks are deployed to sabotage the intent of the summit between Trump and Putin. That they're deploying the war hawks, the neocons in both political parties in the United States, throughout the parliaments in Europe, to sabotage the summit, to defend the interests of the corporate and financial cartels of the City of London and Wall Street. And what they fear is that a Russian-US cooperation, which would then extend to the global South, which is already moving against the Western colonial interests, that this would mean the end of 500 years of colonial rule. And that's what they fear: the loss of cheap raw materials, cheap labor, the ability to manipulate nations through color revolutions and coups and wars. And that's why Zelensky is being wound up into hyperspeed to try to sabotage the Putin-Trump summit. That's why the war hawks and all the governments of the transatlantic region are being mobilized. And that's why the media is running such slanderous coverage, repeating the lies of Russiagate, repeating all the stories of Putin's brutality and of Trump's duplicity. They don't want to see this 500-year era end. But for the rest of the world, the end of this era cannot happen soon enough. Now, let me give you a sense of the British approach to this. There was an op-ed in the Daily Telegraph, sometimes called the Daily Toryograph, which was written by Baron Daniel Hannan, who's a former member of the European Parliament. And here's what Hannan wrote, quote, "Trump has betrayed Ukraine, making the world immeasurably more dangerous. No US president has done more to make the West weak again. It will take decades to repair the damage," unquote. Make the West weak again. What is weak about peace? What is weak about negotiation and diplomacy oriented toward establishing mutual benefit through trade, through economic investment, to create a world in which nations work together, as opposed to finding the separate interests of the corporate oligarchs that can be used to set nations against each other? That's what's at stake this Friday when Presidents Trump and Putin meet in Alaska. Now, I have some links attached in the description section of this update, which include the white paper of the LaRouche organization on the Gabbard declassification. It includes Helga Zepp-LaRouche's letter to Trump and Putin. And there'll be more there for you. Take the time to read these and circulate them. Work on your friends. Share this video. Join with the LaRouche organization. We represent a force that goes back over 50 years of offering an alternative to the unipolar order of war, depression, and predatory looting. And the best thing for the world today would be for the Trump-Putin summit to come out with an agreement for the establishment of the Bering Strait link between Russia and the United States. And this is now being discussed in the Russian media, in the Russian parliament, the Duma. as this has become a central issue as a cause for peace. So join with us. Let's make sure this happens. We cannot afford to let this opportunity go by and give the war hawks another excuse, because they will use war and allow war, including nuclear war, rather than give up